The boy's voice was a ragged whisper, cracking under the weight of fear. "My father will whip me if I don't bring food!" His hands shook. His eyes were wide, not with the simple hunger of a child, but with the deep, primal terror of a cornered animal. Inside his small, dust-choked cabin, the rancher looked at his table. On it sat one loaf of bread and one thin strip of dried meat. It was his only meal for the night, his only comfort in a life defined by emptiness. What he chose to do in that moment would not just change their lives. It would awaken a ghost from a past he thought he had buried deep beneath the prairie soil. The sun bled out across the horizon, painting the endless dust in shades of orange and purple. The wind moaned through the barbed wire fences, a lonely sound for a lonely man. The rancher, Samuel, sat at his crude wooden table. His beard was a wild thing, his hands calloused from work that never ended, and his eyes held the quiet grief of a man who had lost everything. He had no wife, no children, just the sprawling, unforgiving land and the silent company of his cattle. His supper was meager: a single loaf of bread, a strip of beef jerky. It wasn't much, but in the vast silence of his life, it was enough. He was about to bow his head and offer a tired prayer when a knock echoed through the cabin. It wasn't a strong knock. It was hesitant, faint, like a moth beating against a window pane. Samuel rose, his joints groaning in protest. He pulled the heavy door open and saw him, a boy, no older than 10, standing in the fading light. The kid's clothes were little more than rags, his face gaunt, his cheeks hollowed out by starvation, but it was his eyes that stopped Samuel cold. They were filled with a terror so profound it felt ancient. "Please, sir," the boy stammered, his voice barely audible. "My father. He'll whip me if I don't bring food home." The words hit Samuel like a physical blow. A ghost of a memory, sharp and stinging, flashed through his mind. The shadow of his own father, a leather belt raised high. He knew that fear. He knew its bitter taste. He looked down at the boy's trembling hands. The dirt caked under his fingernails. The boy's stomach let out a loud, pathetic growl, and the sound seemed to humiliate him. Tears welled in his eyes, and he looked down at his own bare feet, ashamed. Samuel turned, his gaze falling back on the table, his only meal, his one small comfort in an ocean of solitude. If he gave it away, he would go to bed with the familiar ache of hunger. He knew that pain well, but he also knew the sharp, searing pain of a whip was 100 times worse. The choice was no choice at all. He picked up the knife, intending to cut the loaf in half. That would be fair. A compromise. But as he looked back at the boy, who was clutching the door frame as if it were the only thing holding him up, something inside Samuel broke. A dam of loneliness and regret that had been building for years finally cracked. With a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of his entire life, he tossed the knife aside. He took the whole loaf, the entire strip of meat, wrapped it all in a clean dishcloth, and walked back to the door. "Take it," Samuel said, his voice rough with disuse. He pressed the bundle into the child's shaking hands. The boy looked up, his eyes wide with disbelief. But, sir, won't you go hungry?" Samuel managed a weak, sad smile. "I've been hungry before, son. I'll survive." Tears streamed down the boy's face as he clutched the food to his chest like a holy relic. "Thank you," he whispered. You saved me." He didn't wait for another word. He turned and fled into the rapidly falling darkness, his small form swallowed by the immense prairie night. Samuel closed the door, the sound echoing in the sudden silence. He sat back down at his empty table. His stomach growled, a hollow protest in the quiet cabin. But for the first time in longer than he could remember, his heart felt strangely, impossibly full. That night, sleep wouldn't come. He lay on his cot, staring at the dark wooden beams of the ceiling. For a decade, he had convinced himself that his life was over, that he had nothing left to offer the world. He was a ghost, haunting the ruins of his own past. But the boy's terror, and the simple act of giving away his dinner, had stirred something in him. Kindness, he realized, even when it costs you everything, gives you something back. It gives you a reason. He didn't know then that this was just the beginning. That single act of kindness hadn't just saved a boy from a beating, it had lit a fuse, and the explosion was coming for him. The next evening, just as the sun began its descent, there was another knock. It was the same timid, hesitant sound. Samuel opened the door to find the boy standing there again. But this time, he wasn't alone. A little girl, his sister, clung to his arm, her eyes peeking out shyly from behind his shoulder. Their faces were still thin, but the stark terror from the night before had been replaced by a fragile flicker of hope. The boy, whose name Samuel would later learn was Jacob, held out a small bundle wrapped in cloth. "My mama," he said, his voice still quiet but a little stronger now. "She sent this for you." Samuel took the bundle. Inside was a small, lopsided apple pie. It was unevenly baked, the crust a little burnt on one edge, but it was clear it had been made with care. He stared at it, a lump forming in his throat. It had been years, maybe a decade, since anyone had baked something for him. His meals were a solitary ritual of survival, tasteless and functional. But this pie, this was different. It was gratitude. It was a connection to another human being. It was proof that his small act had sent a ripple out into the world. He knelt down, bringing himself to their level. "You tell your mama I said thank you." He looked at their worn-out shoes and thin frames. "And you too. You come by here anytime you're hungry. A big ranch like this always has work for strong hands." A smile, a real, genuine smile spread across Jacob's face. For the first time, Samuel saw the boy, not just the fear that clung to him. He saw hope. As the children turned and walked back into the dusk, their small hands clasped together, Samuel felt a profound shift inside him. He had given away his only meal, a small price to pay for what he had received in return. He had found a glimmer of family in the loneliest place on earth. And for a man who believed his soul was as barren as the land around him, that was a treasure more valuable than gold. But as he watched them disappear, he noticed something else. They kept looking back over their shoulders, as if they were being followed, as if the darkness itself was hunting them. And that's when a cold knot of dread began to tighten in Samuel's stomach. The pie wasn't just a thank you, it was a message, and the story was far from over. The days that followed fell into a strange, new rhythm. Jacob would appear in the afternoons, a silent, hard-working shadow. He helped mend fences, his small hands struggling but determined. His sister, Anna, would follow, a little basket on her arm filled with wild herbs or flowers their mother had sent. She was quiet, almost ghost-like, but her presence, her small, humming songs as she weeded Samuel's neglected garden, began to fill the oppressive silence of the ranch. Slowly, painfully, Samuel's lonely cabin started to feel like a home. He would share his simple meals with them, and for the first time in years, the wooden table didn't feel so empty. He'd watch them eat, their hunger so desperate it was painful, and he made sure they never left with empty stomachs. He learned about their mother, a gentle woman named Alara, who was trying her best to hold her small family together. He learned about their father, Thomas, a man broken by something Jacob couldn't or wouldn't explain. One evening, Samuel gave Jacob an old, whittled horse he had carved years ago for a son he never had. The boy's eyes lit up, a pure, unadulterated joy that felt like sunshine in the dusty cabin. But sunshine casts a shadow, and the shadow found them. It was late one evening. The children had just left, their laughter still seeming to hang in the air. Samuel was cleaning his plate when a figure blocked the light from his doorway. He looked up and saw a man, tall and gaunt, with eyes as hard and cold as river stones. His face was a mask of resentment. It was Thomas, the children's father. "I hear you've been feeding my kids," the man snarled, his voice a low growl. He stepped into the cabin, bringing a chill with him. "Think you're some kind of saint? Playing the big man? Giving them handouts?" Samuel slowly rose to his feet. He was older, but he was a big man, his frame hardened by decades of ranch work. He didn't move, didn't flinch. He just met the man's hateful glare. "They're hungry," Samuel said, his voice calm and steady. "They're my responsibility," Thomas spat. "They don't need charity from some lonely old hermit. You stay away from them. You understand me?" His hand rested on the hilt of a large knife tucked into his belt. The threat was unspoken but hung heavy in the air. Samuel's eyes never left the man's. He saw the anger, the misplaced pride, but beneath it, he saw something else. The same terror he had seen in Jacob's eyes that first night. This man wasn't just cruel. He was afraid. "They are children," Samuel said, his voice dropping low, each word deliberate. "They need kindness, and they need food. If they come to my door hungry, I will feed them." Thomas's jaw tightened, his knuckles white where he gripped his knife. The air in the cabin was electric, a spark away from violence. For a long, tense moment, the two men stood like statues, locked in a silent battle of wills. Finally, Thomas let out a frustrated curse, spat on Samuel's clean floor, and stormed out, his angry muttering swallowed by the wind. That night, Samuel didn't sleep. He sat in his chair, watching the door, a heavy shotgun resting across his lap. He worried that he had made things worse. He worried that the father's rage would now fall on the children, that he had driven them away for good. The sun was barely a sliver of orange on the horizon when he heard a frantic scratching at his door. He threw it open. Jacob and Anna stood there, their faces streaked with tears, their bodies trembling. "Mama sent us," Jacob whispered, his voice choked with sobs. "She said he's in a rage. She said he can't be reasoned with." The boy looked up at Samuel, his eyes pleading. "But she told us. She told us if we came here, we would be safe." Samuel's heart, which he thought had turned to stone years ago, broke. He knelt down, his old knees cracking, and pulled the two trembling children into his arms. He held them tight, a fierce, protective fire flaring to life in his chest. "This is your home now," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name. "This is your refuge. I swear on my life, no one will ever lay a hand on you here." He had given away a loaf of bread. In return, the universe had given him a war to fight. And as he held the sobbing children, he realized he wasn't just a rancher anymore. He was a protector. He was a shield. And he would stand against the storm, no matter how hard the wind blew. But he still didn't understand the true nature of the storm. He thought he was fighting to protect these children from their father. The truth was infinitely more terrifying. The father wasn't the storm. He was just the first drop of rain. The next day, a fragile peace settled over the ranch. Jacob and Anna stayed close, their fear slowly receding in the calm, steady presence of Samuel. They did their chores, but their eyes constantly darted towards the long, dusty road that led to the property. Their mother, Alara, had not come with them. The thought of her alone with that man gnawed at Samuel. In the late afternoon, as Samuel was showing Jacob how to properly brush down a horse, Anna came running from the cabin, her face pale. She was holding the small, lopsided pie tin their mother had sent over days ago. "Look," she whispered, her finger tracing something on the bottom of the tin. Samuel took it from her. He had washed it out, ready to send it back. But now he saw it. Scratched into the metal, so faint it was almost invisible, was a picture. It was a crude, desperate drawing. A stick figure of a man, their father, cowering on the ground. Standing over him was another, much larger figure. This second man held a whip, and his face was a vortex of angry scribbles, but the most chilling detail was the brand drawn on the second man's hat, a simple C inside a circle. It was a symbol Samuel had not seen in over 15 years, a symbol he had prayed he would never see again. Ice flowed through his veins, his blood ran cold, the world seemed to tilt on its axis. This wasn't about a broke, angry farmer taking his frustrations out on his family. This was something else entirely. This was organized. This was predatory. This was the work of Silas Croft. The name was a ghost from another life, a life where Samuel wasn't a lonely rancher, but a U.S. Marshal. a life where he wore a badge, not worn-out denim. Silas the Baron Croft was a land leech, a monster who preyed on the weak, using debt and violence to swallow up homesteads and build a personal empire of fear. Samuel had hunted him, had dismantled his gang in a bloody shootout that had cost him everything. He had seen Croft go down. He was sure he was dead. Clearly, he had been wrong. The past he had run from, the violence he had tried to bury, had found him. It had knocked on his door in the form of a terrified child. Croft was here, in this quiet corner of the world, and he was using Thomas, the children's father, as his puppet. Thomas wasn't the villain of this story. He was a prisoner, just like his family. The whippings Jacob feared weren't from his father's hand. They were from the hand of the man who owned his father's soul. Everything suddenly made a terrifying kind of sense. The father's fear, the family's poverty, the constant looking over their shoulders. That evening, as darkness fell, Samuel pulled a heavy, dust-covered trunk from beneath his cot. He blew a thick layer of dust off the top and unlatched the rusty buckles. The smell of old leather and gun oil filled the small cabin. Inside, resting on a bed of worn velvet, was a Colt Peacemaker, its steel barrel gleaming in the lantern light. Next to it was a tarnished silver star, a marshal's badge. He picked up the revolver. It felt heavy in his hand, a familiar, terrible weight. He had put this life behind him. He had sought peace in solitude, hoping to let the man he once was die. But Silas Croft was a disease, and he had followed him. There was no running. There was no hiding. The lonely rancher was gone. In his place stood Marshal Samuel Kane, and he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that Croft's men were coming, not just for the children, but for the man who dared to protect them. He checked the cylinder of the Colt. 6 bullets. It wouldn't be enough. He looked out the window, into the vast, unforgiving darkness. The wind howled, and it sounded like a warning. The fight for this small, broken family was about to become a war for the soul of the entire valley. And Samuel was standing right at the heart of the storm. The hours ticked by, each one a lifetime. Samuel didn't sleep. He sat in his worn armchair, the Colt resting on his lap, his eyes fixed on the moonlit path leading to his cabin. Jacob and Anna were asleep in his cot, their small bodies curled together for comfort, their faces peaceful for the first time in days. They were safe for now. But the coming dawn promised violence. Samuel's mind was a whirlwind. He was no longer a young marshal, quick on the draw and backed by the law. He was an old man, his body stiff, his reflexes dulled by time and grief. Croft would have men, a dozen at least, all of them hard cases who lived by the gun. Samuel had his wits, a revolver, a shotgun, and the element of surprise. It was a long shot, a suicide mission. But as he looked at the sleeping children, he knew he had no other choice. He had run once before, after the shootout that took his wife and son, a shootout orchestrated by Croft's men as retribution. He had run from the grief, from the guilt, from the man he was. He wouldn't run again. This time, he would make his stand. This time, he would finish what he started all those years ago. Just before the first light of dawn, he heard it. Not the thunder of a dozen horses, but a single, frantic set of footsteps. He was at the door in an instant, shotgun in hand. A figure stumbled out of the darkness and collapsed onto his porch. It was Alara, the children's mother. Her face was bruised, her dress torn. She was gasping for breath, her body shaking with terror and exhaustion. "He knows," she choked out, looking up at Samuel with wild eyes. "Thomas didn't come home. Croft kept him. One of his men came to the cabin. He said Croft knows the children are here. He said he's coming to collect his property." Samuel helped her inside, his face a grim mask. He sat her down and gave her a glass of water. "They're not his property," Samuel said, his voice hard as iron. Alara started to weep, her body racked with silent sobs. "It's my fault. All of it. The debt. Thomas took a loan from Croft to buy seed after the drought. The interest was impossible. We fell behind. Croft took the deed to our land as collateral. Thomas has been working it off ever since, but the debt only grows. Croft owns us. He owns everything. She reached into a small pouch tied around her waist and pulled out a small, dented silver locket. It was the same one Jacob had dropped that first night. "This is all we have left," she whispered, pressing it into Samuel's hand. "It was my grandmother's. Croft has tried to take it a dozen times, but I've kept it hidden. He thinks it's just silver." Samuel took the locket. It felt heavier now, knowing its history. He opened the small clasp. This time, it wasn't empty. Tucked inside, folded into a tiny, perfect square, was a fragile, yellowed piece of paper. He carefully unfolded it. It was a deed. The original, official deed to their land, filed with the territorial office and bearing the governor's seal. It predated Croft's crooked contract by 20 years. It was legal, binding, and irrefutable proof that Croft was a fraud. This was the key. This was their salvation. But it was also their death warrant. As long as they had it, Croft would never stop hunting them. "He's not just coming for the children, is he?" Samuel asked, his eyes locking with hers. "He's coming for this." Alara nodded, tears streaming down her face. "He told Thomas that if he didn't get the locket by sunrise, he'd make an example of him for the whole valley to see." The sun was beginning to rise. Samuel looked from the deed in his hand to the sleeping children, to their terrified mother. He was out of time. Croft wasn't just coming to intimidate them. He was coming to execute a man and seize the last piece of evidence that could bring him down. He walked to the window and looked out at the vast, empty prairie. But it wasn't empty anymore. On the distant ridge, silhouetted against the rising sun, were a dozen riders. They weren't moving fast. They were taking their time, confident, like wolves circling their prey before the final attack. The siege was about to begin. Samuel turned back to Alara. "Get the children into the cellar," he commanded, his voice ringing with the authority of the marshal he once was. "Bar the door and do not open it, no matter what you hear." He picked up the shotgun, grabbed a box of shells from the trunk, and walked onto the porch. He stood there, a lone figure against the coming tide, the rising sun casting his long shadow across the dry, thirsty earth. He was old, he was alone, and he was hopelessly outgunned. But he was no longer running. He was home, and he would defend it to his last breath. The riders advanced slowly, their arrogance a palpable force. They fanned out, forming a loose semicircle around the small cabin, their horses kicking up clouds of dust that shimmered in the morning light. At their center rode Silas Croft. He looked older, a scar cutting through one eyebrow that hadn't been there 15 years ago. But his eyes held the same reptilian coldness. He reined in his horse about 50 yards from the porch and smirked. "Well, well," Croft's voice boomed across the clearing, dripping with condescending amusement. "Look what we have here, a lonely old farmer playing hero. I've come for my property, old man, the woman, the children, and a little silver locket. Give them to me now, and I'll let you live out your miserable days in peace." He had Thomas with him. The man was slumped over his horse, his hands tied, his face a swollen, bloody mess. He was alive, but barely. He was Croft's bargaining chip. Samuel didn't answer. He just stood there, the shotgun held loosely at his side. He watched them, his eyes scanning each rider, assessing their positions, their weapons. He was calm. It was the strange, supernatural calm that comes before a storm, before everything erupts into chaos. "I don't hear you, old-timer," Croft shouted, his amusement turning to irritation. "Are you deaf? I am a patient man, but my patience is wearing thin. Send them out." Samuel slowly raised the shotgun, resting the stock against his shoulder. The motion was fluid, practiced, a muscle memory from a different lifetime. The lazy confidence on Croft's face flickered. This wasn't the posture of a scared farmer. This was the posture of a man who knew how to use the weapon he was holding. "You're not taking anyone, Silas." Samuel's voice cut through the morning air, clear and strong. Croft froze. His eyes narrowed. That voice. That name. He stared at Samuel, a flicker of disbelief, then dawning horror, transforming his features. The confident smirk melted away, replaced by a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. "You!" Croft hissed, the word filled with venom. "It can't be. You're dead." "Not yet," Samuel replied, his finger tightening on the trigger. "You should have made sure the first time." In that moment of stunned recognition, Samuel made his move. He wasn't aiming for Croft. The distance was too great for a shotgun. He was aiming for the large water trough near the horses. He fired. The blast shattered the morning quiet. The wooden trough exploded, sending a geyser of water and splinters into the air. The horses panicked. They reared and screamed, their riders fighting to control them. The perfect semicircle dissolved into chaos. It was the opening Samuel needed. He ducked back into the cabin as the first bullets from Croft's men ripped through the wooden porch. He barred the door, moved to a window, and fired the second barrel, taking down the closest rider. He dropped the shotgun, drew the Colt, and became a ghost. The cabin, which had seemed like a flimsy trap, was now his fortress. He had spent the last hours preparing. He had loosened floorboards, knocked small holes in the walls for sightlines, and positioned his few pieces of furniture for cover. Croft's men were expecting a terrified farmer they could flush out. Instead, they found themselves in a kill box designed by a master tactician. One of the thugs tried to rush the front door. Samuel fired through the wood, and the man dropped. Two more tried to circle around the back. Samuel was waiting at the rear window, the Colt barking twice in quick succession. The fight was fast, brutal, and intimate. Croft's men were cowboys and bullies, not soldiers. They were used to terrorizing unarmed families, not fighting a trained lawman on his own ground. They were being picked apart. From outside, Croft's voice roared with fury. "Burn him out! Burn the whole damn cabin to the ground!" Samuel heard the crackle of a torch being lit. He knew he couldn't stay inside. He had to move. He crawled to the cellar door and knocked twice. "Alara, stay down!" he yelled. He took a deep breath, kicked open the back door, and charged out into the open, firing as he ran for the cover of the nearby stables. Bullets tore through the air around him, kicking up dust at his feet. One grazed his arm, a hot, searing pain. He ignored it. He made it to the stable, diving behind a stack of hay bales just as the first flames began to lick at the side of his cabin. He was pinned down. Croft's remaining men were taking cover, laying down a field of fire. The cabin was burning. The family was trapped in the cellar, and Thomas was still tied to Croft's horse, a helpless pawn in the center of the storm. Samuel was out of options. His gamble had failed. And then he heard it. A sound that made the hairs on his arm stand up. A single, high-powered rifle shot that echoed from the ridge behind him. It wasn't one of Croft's men. It came from the other direction. One of the gunmen pinning him down slumped over, a neat hole in his chest. Another shot rang out. A second gunman fell. Samuel looked towards the ridge. Standing there, rifle in hand, was a grizzled old man with a long white beard. Jebediah, his old deputy, the fastest rifle in 3 territories. Jacob had made it. The message had been delivered. The tide had just turned. Hope, which had been all but extinguished, flared back to life. With Jeb providing cover fire, the dynamic of the fight shifted completely. The hunters became the hunted. Croft's men, caught between Samuel's Colt and Jeb's unerring rifle, broke. They were mercenaries, not loyalists. They had signed up for easy money, not to die in a pitched battle against a ghost and his sharpshooting friend. 2 of them spurred their horses and fled, riding hard for the horizon. Croft was left with only 2 men, his rage boiling over into desperation. He saw his empire of fear crumbling around him. He dragged Thomas from his horse, pulling him to his feet and pressing the barrel of his pistol to the man's temple. "It's over, Kane!" he screamed, his voice cracking. "You hear me? Call off your man on the ridge, or this one dies right now! I'll still win! I'll kill him! I'll kill his family, and then I'll spend the rest of my life hunting you!" Samuel stepped out from behind the stables, his Colt held steady in his hand. Jeb ceased his fire. The world went silent. save for the crackling of the flames devouring Samuel's home. The three men, Samuel, Croft, and the terrified Thomas between them, stood in a tense triangle of fate. "Let him go, Silas," Samuel said, his voice dangerously calm. "It's me you want." "I want it all!" Croft shrieked, his eyes wild. He was a cornered animal, spitting and snarling. "I want the deed, I want the land, and I want your head on a pike." "The deed won't help you," Samuel said, taking a slow step forward. "That little piece of paper in the locket? That's the real one, the one your contract can't touch. It's over. The whole valley will know what you are by sundown." Croft laughed, a high, unhinged sound. "There won't be a sundown for you, or for him." He tightened his grip on Thomas, preparing to pull the trigger. But in that split second, Thomas, who had been a broken, passive victim for years, found a spark of his old self. Seeing his home burn, seeing a stranger risk his life for his family, he made a choice. He was not going to be a pawn anymore. With a desperate roar, Thomas slammed his head back into Croft's face. The crunch of breaking bone echoed in the silence. Croft staggered, his pistol firing harmlessly into the sky. That was all the opening Samuel needed. The Colt Peacemaker bucked in his hand. The shot was perfect. Silas Croft's eyes went wide with surprise. He looked down at the dark red stains spreading across his chest, then up at the man who had haunted him for 15 years. He opened his mouth to say something, but only a wet gurgle came out. He crumpled to the ground, his reign of terror finally, truly over. Silence fell. The fire crackled. Thomas stood panting, his eyes fixed on the body of his tormentor. From the cellar door, Ilara and the children emerged, blinking in the bright sunlight, their faces stained with soot and tears. They were alive. They were free. The flames consumed what was left of the cabin, but no one was watching it. They were all looking at each other. A broken family and a lonely old man, standing in the ashes of the past, finally able to look towards the future. The fight was over, but the work of healing was just beginning. In the weeks that followed, a new world took shape. With Croft gone and his fraudulent contracts exposed by the deed in the locket, the grip of fear over the valley was broken. The corrupt town sheriff was run out on a rail, and Jebediah, with a reluctant sigh, pinned on the badge himself. The homesteaders who had lived in terror for years were finally free. Samuel's cabin was a pile of charred timber, but it didn't matter. With the help of grateful neighbors, a new house began to rise from the ashes, bigger and stronger than the old one. It was built not just with wood and nails, but with gratitude and community. Thomas recovered from his wounds. He was a changed man, the shame and fear replaced by a quiet determination. He worked alongside Samuel every day, rebuilding the house, mending the fences, and slowly, painstakingly, mending the trust with his family. There were no easy apologies, no quick fixes. Healing was a slow, arduous process. He knew he had a long road to walk before he could truly be the father his children deserved. One evening, as the new frame of the house stood stark against the sunset, Thomas found Samuel looking out over the ranch. "I don't know how to thank you, Samuel," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You don't have to," Samuel replied. "You fought for your family when it counted. You're a free man now, Thomas." Thomas nodded, looking over at Alara, who was teaching Anna how to braid wildflowers, and Jacob, who was trying to mimic Samuel's stoic posture. "They're free too," he said softly, "and they're happier here. They're safer. With you." It was the hardest thing he had ever had to say. "I need to go. I need to find my own way, to become a man they can be proud of. Until that day, will you look after them?" It wasn't a question of duty. It was a plea, an act of true, selfless love. Samuel looked at the family that had, against all odds, become his own. The silence of his life had been filled with laughter, with scraped knees, with bedtime stories. He had given away a single loaf of bread, and in return, he had been given back his soul. "I will," Samuel said, placing a hand on Thomas's shoulder. "They'll always have a home here, and so will you, when you're ready to come back to it." The next morning, Thomas rode out, not as a man running away, but as a man on a journey toward redemption. Samuel stood on his new porch, Jacob on one side, Anna on the other, Alara standing behind them. He was no longer a ghost haunting the prairie. He was a father, he was a husband, he was home. The past was buried, the future was bright, and his heart, which he had long thought was as barren as the dust, was full. One small act of kindness on one lonely night had not just saved a family, it had rebuilt a world. If you believe that even in the darkest of times, a single act of courage and kindness can change everything, don't forget to like this video and hit that subscribe button. You never know when one small choice will rewrite your entire story.